had a great weekend. We did. It was a lot of pretty weather this weekend. We got to work outside in our yard, and hopefully you got to spend some time outside as well this weekend. Good morning to you. Good morning to everyone, including our guests this morning. We'd like to welcome you, especially today. If you haven't had a chance to stop by our welcome counter just outside the doors here, we encourage you to stop by there, pick up one of our guest cards and fill that out and leave that for us. It helps us get to know you, and then we also get an opportunity to reach out to you later this week and let you get to know us a little bit as well. We're in the second week of our sermon series, Tell Them Your Story. Today's sermon is entitled, Tell Them with Strategy. As we look at Paul's interaction with the people of Athens, if you would turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 17, we're going to start in verse 16. We're going to get right to it this morning. Normally I have a little introduction time, but we're going to get right into God's Word this morning. We're going to start with verse 16. If you don't have a Bible, we encourage you to grab one from the pews there. Some of you closer towards the back might notice that we've purchased some of the larger print Bibles, and hopefully those will be a little easier to see. The original ones we got were a little small, so we've ordered even more of those are coming. So we're going to replace all of them in here with the larger print and use the others for the food pantry handouts. So but those are on their way. So good to have those. And please, if you don't have a Bible, take one with you. That's what they're there for. We want you to have a Bible of your own. So in our text from today, Paul was on his second missionary journey that took him through what is now modern-day Turkey and Greece. He visited Antioch and Lystra and Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea and Athens and Corinth and Ephesus before returning to Jerusalem. From Acts 15 through Acts 18, we get the details of that trip. Paul witnessed to, I'm sure, what were hundreds and maybe even thousands of people as he made this journey around this area. We're going to look specifically today at his encounter with the people of Athens. You see, I believe that Paul, when he went and met with these people, when he spent some time with these people, he used some strategy. He used some things that he observed and heard and saw and listened to help guide him through the process of witnessing to the people of Athens. He did this by building relationships, which is something that we have hammered on quite a bit here in the last couple of months. So let's start in Acts 17, starting in verse 16 through 34. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and we have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. In the telling of the gospel message in this text today, Paul uses some of the same elements, many of the same elements that Peter had used on the day of Pentecost that we studied last week. Some of those very same elements are there, but they're just in a slightly different order. We first have the idea of creation presented. In verse 24, if you'll notice, he says, God, who made the world and everything in it, is Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he also talks about man being created in that part of the text. There's also talk and discussion of the fall of man, why we need salvation. Because we fell, because we chose to live differently than what God wanted. In verse 30, he talks a little bit about that. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Which is also the third idea, that we have a response that we have to give. We have to respond to God. We have to respond to his call. And Paul talks about that there as well in verse 30. And finally, he talks about Jesus. In verse 31, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. That's Jesus. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So he even talks about and describes for the people in Athens there, he talks about the resurrection. So again, Paul has used all of the same elements that Peter had used when he told the people on the day of Pentecost. And these are all the same elements that we've talked about in our Sunday school time and during last week's message. So Paul uses a little bit different approach. He does it a little bit differently than Peter. Peter just stands up that day, the day of Pentecost, and just rips off this amazing sermon and inspires thousands of people to follow Jesus. Paul uses a little bit different way of doing it. He uses strategy and relationship. Paul, as he's traveling around all of these areas, uses this strategy and relationship as he presents the gospel to different people. So first, in this idea of Paul's different approach, he gets to know the town and the people. If we look at verse 16, I think it's important to note that Paul spent significant amounts of time in each town he visited. This second journey, the second missionary journey that Paul has taken, took 3 years to accomplish. He would spend months at a time with different people groups as he stopped in each town. He would take time learning their cultural differences. He would live amongst them. He would spend time getting to know people, individuals. He would listen to their stories. And ultimately, he would share the gospel. He had to help to found churches in all of these towns on his first missionary journey. As he traveled around the first time, he founded churches in many of these towns. But in some of the towns, like Athens in this case, this was the first time that he was really presenting the gospel message in this location. As he goes in, he is forging ahead. He's presenting the gospel for the first time. And these people of Athens that he's encountering are thinkers. They are philosophers. They are scholars. It would be like us today going to the campus of Yale or Harvard or Stanford and sitting in on the discussions amongst all the professors as they sat and they discussed really deep topics and subjects. That would be like what it was like to go into Athens at the time. There's lots of thinkers and deep thinkers and scholars and philosophers. Paul took note of the scenery as well. You can tell a lot about a culture by looking around at the architecture, the artwork, the places of worship. And Paul took note of all of these things. Paul took it all in, and over the course of days or weeks or months, we don't know, we're not told in this particular text how long he was there, but he sat in on meetings at the synagogue. He had discussions with people in the marketplace, it says. Day after day he was there, listening, learning, watching, taking it all in, and sometimes working himself into conversations and debates with the people there. All the while, he was doing our second point, which was Paul spent time building a relationship with these philosophers. We see in the passage here that Paul is spending time each day debating with the philosophers. And I don't see this as an adversarial debate. This wasn't like a presidential debate where there's two ideas and they're being presented and there's maybe some argumentation going on between the two groups. In this time and in this place, these sharing of ideas and philosophy was done very peaceful. They were hungry to learn new ideas and have new ideas, and there was peaceful passing of information back and forth between the parties. So I think it was an interesting time. They were talking about what they believed, and Paul was sharing what he believed about Jesus. And they were so perplexed by what he was saying that they decided to bring him before the Areopagus, which was a council of scholars and philosophers that met regularly to debate topics and discuss intellectual ideas and philosophy. The thing we have to recognize here is that had Paul not spent time with an effort to go into the marketplace, and go into the synagogue and rub shoulders with the people, have conversations and build relationships, he never would have had the opportunity to go to the Areopagus and present the gospel message to some of the greatest thinkers of the day. Paul invested in these people. He got to know them. He found out things about them. He learned about what made them tick. He found out what they cared about. And then once he had the whole picture, once he had learned everything he needed to know, he got this opportunity to speak. And when he did, our third idea here is that Paul found something from their culture that he could use to communicate the gospel. I love that Paul uses this altar to the unknown God, it says. Here, he saw this altar to the unknown God. He's like, I'm using that. I'm going to use that when I get my chance. When I get my opportunity, I'm going to use that to explain to them this gospel of Jesus. And I think it was a stroke of pure genius. But it came from studying the people, listening to them, observing their culture, their city, their places of worship. Had Paul just stayed in the proverbial hotel when he came to town, if he'd have just stayed where the tourists stay, if he'd have just stayed with people that were just like him, if he'd have just stayed with Jews, or if he'd just stayed with other Christians, and he never rubbed shoulders and never spent any time amongst the other people, he never would have had this opportunity. But he did do the work, and he did build the relationships. So when he spoke, and he used this strategy, he had a credibility that spoke volumes. Much like Peter's story from last week, though, I want to point out that not everybody in attendance that day at the Areopagus believed. It said some of them sneered at him. But there were some that did believe. And they wanted to know more about Jesus. They said, how can this be? Can you tell us more about this? And they wanted to spend more time with him. Paul, at this point, has leveraged his relationship with the people to gain an opportunity to present the gospel and to speak to them some more. And from their numbers, people like Dionysius and Damaris, it says, and a number of others became Christ followers. Unlike Peter's story where thousands came forward, Paul identified and worked with the few and got them to believe and fed them and filled them up with all they needed to know, with the hope and the trust that they would then be ones who would share that gospel message even after he left. Paul really gives us a great illustration of what it means to do evangelism by way of first forming relationships. And then based on how Paul built his relationships throughout the book of Acts, I think we see some common steps for us to build relationships with others. And I want to share those steps with you this morning. This is where we get our application. This is where we can take some of what we learned today and apply it to our own lives so that we will be more successful as we build relationships. Number one, we have to make time in our schedule for them. Folks, we have to make time in our schedules for people. When we are building relationships with people, it means we have to commit to giving up time in our lives to give them some attention, to getting to know them. And this is the number one item on the list for a reason. Our lives are full, aren't they? Our lives are busy. Our lives are jam-packed with all kinds of stuff. We have a lot going on. One of the reasons I think evangelism has fallen along the wayside in our modern culture is because our lives are too full. We're too preoccupied with self to add anyone else into our schedule. How many of you see a neighbor walking out in the street, walking down the sidewalk, or maybe out across the street, they're working in their yard, working away and stuff, and they look at you? How many of you divert your eye contact? Hoping that they don't make the connection and start a conversation with you. Because you're thinking, I've got so much to do. I got so many things I have to accomplish. I've got so many things on my list for today that if I don't get right to that list, I'm not going to get it all done. And you don't even take that 5 minutes to walk up to the edge of the property line and have that conversation with that neighbor and encourage them and talk to them and find out a little bit about them. Most times we just pull into our driveways, let the garage door shut behind us, and we stay in our house, right? Our fortress of solitude, as it were, to try to take care of our time and protect our time. But it's really important for us to understand that we have to give time to others and invest that time in others so that we can build relationships. How many of you use that? How many of you see that person at work? You know that person I'm talking about, that person that is needy, that person that maybe has a lot of drama in their life. And they sit down with you at the lunch table and you're like, oh boy, here we go. I'm not even going to be able to enjoy my lunch today because they're going to just keep talking and talking and talking. We have those kinds of things that happen in our lives. We get those opportunities, and sometimes we try to avoid them because it's going to require us to give up some of our time. I think we're all guilty of over-scheduling ourselves. Even preachers, we over-schedule ourselves all the time, don't we? But I also think sometimes we often think our time is too important and too valuable to be wasted on relationships. And folks, that, I think, is a shame. Because we need to make time in our lives for others. If we don't make time in our lives to spend with other people, how are we ever going to have those opportunities to share the gospel message? The second idea, or the second step of relationship building is to ask questions and then listen. That lost art of listening. We talked about that a little bit in our prayer sermon during our Grow Up series. When we talk with God, sometimes we talk and talk and talk, and then we say amen, and we walk out the door. We never listen to God. And we do that same thing with people sometimes, don't we? We maybe ask a question, and we give them about 2 seconds to answer it, and then we're on to the next topic. And we don't listen to what they have to say. I encourage you, instead of asking a question and then immediately thinking about some next story that you want to tell about yourself, ask a sincere question, and then not only close your mouth, but also tell your brain, don't think of anything else, and listen to what they have to say. Commit it. Think about it. Listen to it. Maybe even repeat some of it back to them to make sure you got the story straight. Let them know that you are listening to what they have to say. I know so many people who have trouble with names and remembering things about people, and again, I think it's because we don't listen carefully. We don't listen and take things in and commit it to our minds. I know that's why I have tried so hard to get out and visit with folks. Visit in your homes, visit at your places where you live, because I can't get to know people on a Sunday morning. When there's a couple of hundred people here in the building and everybody's wanting just a couple of minutes to say hi, I can't remember all those details and all those things. But if I get a chance to sit down and meet with you one-on-one or one-on-two, I have that opportunity to get to know so much more about you. And really get a feel for who you are. And I haven't gotten a chance to sit down with everybody yet, but I've done quite a few. And I look forward to continuing as this year goes along, continuing to meet with different ones of you who are willing to sit down with me. The next idea is to observe their environment. Observe their environment for clues, other clues about who they are. Another great thing about getting out and meeting people where they live and seeing them in their homes, rather than just getting to know you at church, is I get to observe your environment. And if I've come over and you have cleaned the house specifically just for me to arrive, you don't need to do that. Just be yourselves. I want to get to know you because I want to observe your environment. I want to see who you are by the surroundings that you have. And it's neat because I've gotten to see so many cool pictures of grandkids on the walls and family members and great-grandchildren. Like the Turners have like 27 great-grandbabies. They have they have a whole wall in their house with pictures of their great-grandchildren and grandchildren. It's amazing. It's like walking into the Smithsonian or something. It's pretty cool. But it's neat to see those things. I've got to meet some of your pets. I've gotten to see some neat things hanging on the walls, some neat artwork, some accolades that you've received over the years. I've gotten to hear you tell stories. I've gotten to hear ideas and thoughts that you have. It's very cool to have those moments. And when I do, I get that full picture of who you are. Some of you have even fed me cookies and snacks and things, and I appreciate that, but please, I'm on a diet, so slow down with the cookies and things, because I love them, and I can't say no. But it's so cool to get a chance to sit down and listen, and find out that maybe somebody was in the military, and you didn't even know it. You know, they served the country. They've done awesome things to protect our way of living. You might find out that someone coached a sport, coached a high school team, coached something, or maybe they were a teacher, or they are an expert quilter, or they are a fantastic cook, or they like to play golf. You find out all these little details that you have in the conversations when you devote time that you can't find out at church on a Sunday morning in a 2-minute conversation. And I encourage you to start doing that with each other and with your neighbors and people that you're trying to build relationships with. Spend time with them and observe their environments. Now, at work or school, it may be a little tougher to observe environments, but you still can. You can go to someone's workplace and kind of look at their workstation or their area to see if they have any pictures up of family, or you see any little knickknacks like my big giant Batman that I have standing in my office. You get to know a little bit about a person just by observing their environment. Kids here that are here today, you're like, well, how am I supposed to observe my friend's environment if I don't go to their house? Go to their locker and stand beside them while they're getting their books out. You can tell a lot about a student by what the inside of their locker door looks like. They usually have some type of decorations or pictures or something on there. Or, if they were like me when I was a kid, their locker is just a disaster. And so you get to learn something about them in that regard as you observe their environment. We can learn a lot just by watching and looking and observing. We can also do this through our modern age of technology, through social media. Now, I don't want to encourage you to do all of your observing through social media, because that can be a colossal waste of time. But you can use social media to find out stuff about people, what they like, what they do, what their family looks like, because they always post the pictures of their kids and stuff on there. You can find out a lot about people just by looking at social media as well. The main thought here is that when we observe a new friend's environment, we can find some clues on how to reach them. Just like Paul used that altar of an unknown God when he went into the city and he was observing their surroundings. And he saw that, he's like, I'm going to use that. He committed it to his memory. We can do the same thing when we see something in a person's environment that might spark a discussion and say, I'm going to remember that, and I'm going to use that next time I have a chance to sit down and talk with them. Now, the fourth step in building a relationship is don't talk about yourself unless you're asked. This may be a tough one for some of you. That was supposed to be fun. But seriously, we all struggle a little bit with that one, don't we? We like to talk about ourselves. And I've talked about before that there's this natural chemical release in your brain that makes you feel good when you talk about yourself. It gets you a little pumped up, gets you fired up. It's good. It's a good thing. It's a good feeling. And when it can be a very helpful thing in evangelism later down the road when your relationship is going strong, to be able to talk about yourself a little bit. We're going to talk about that next week and the week after a little bit more. But in this initial stages, while you're building that relationship, make sure that you ask that question like we talked about, and then try not to talk too much about yourself. Now, if a person asks a question of us, it's proper and it's good for us to reveal things about ourselves. That's part of building a relationship, is to tell them a little bit. But make sure if you're a gregarious, outgoing person that you don't dominate the conversation, that you give them time to share their ideas and their thoughts. Again, this is not an indictment about those of you who are outgoing people. That's a good thing, and keep it up. Just a reminder to make sure you're giving the other person proper time and you're listening to them. The next step is to find things that you have in common that can sustain future conversations. Sometimes if you don't do a little note-taking in your brain a little bit and remember things that you have in common, it may be a little harder to have that second and that third conversation. But if you can remember some of those common things, it can help you springboard into those next conversations. If you're like me at all, you can't remember everything somebody tells you. But if you can remember one or two things, key items, maybe they tell you what their anniversary is, or they give you some information about a child, their child is doing a sport or an activity or something that your child once did. Or they may work in a profession that is similar to the one that you worked in. You can use those things to help guide further conversations and open the door to further conversations down the road. The more conversations you have with a person, the more likely you are going to be able to solidify that relationship, which will give you that opportunity, hopefully, to eventually share the gospel. Finally, we need to make sure before you part ways that they know you care about them. They have to know that you care. Sometimes as we're building relationships for the purposes of evangelism, in the back of our minds, we can come off at some point looking judgmental, or maybe like we're trying to take advantage of them, or that we're trying to manipulate them in some way. That's not the case. We should want to truly care about that person, and we should care about that person, and we should prove to them that we care about them. And we do this by remembering key things about them, like where they were, members of their family, maybe when their birthday or anniversary is, maybe when you pick up something, you pick up on something as you're discussing that they have this need. And they haven't necessarily asked you to do anything, but you hear this need, and you say, I'm going to respond to that need to prove to them that I care about them. This may be something that requires you to give up a little more time. Something that requires you to give a little more effort. One thing I would encourage you to do is, before you part ways, always ask them if you can pray for them. Always ask that. This can be a first step in you revealing your faith to them without actually, you don't have to share the gospel yet, but you can show them that through praying for them that you care about them. That's a great way to just tell them that, hey, I want to pray for you. And don't just say that you're going to pray for them. Don't say, hey, is there anything I can pray for you about? And then they tell you and then you walk away. Spend time right in that moment. Stop and pray with them. It can be a powerful thing. In all my encounters with people who did not know Jesus, I have never had a single person tell me no when I've asked them if I can pray with them. Not a single one. I did over 80 death notifications and even more counseling appointments at the Montgomery County Jail when I was the chaplain there. In 4 years' time, and I asked every single inmate that I met with, can I pray with you? And every single one of them, most of whom were obviously not Christians and obviously did not go to church regularly, every single one of them said yes. When we pray for people, it is one of those things, one of those small things that we can do that shows them that we care. And again, that revelation that you have faith comes about. And it might spark a question. It might open a door for a future conversation about your faith and how they can have that faith too. All of this leads us to our main point today. To effectively reach some people for Christ, you must cultivate a relationship. We live in a farming community, so I used a farming word, right? We have to cultivate a relationship. Think about that word that I chose. Cultivate is a transitive